Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. I am Tanya Janca. I am your host, and this is Sherif Koussa. He is my guest today. Welcome to the SAST versus DAST webinar, where Sherif and I are going to just talk a lot about AppSec. There won't actually be any fighting. As you can see, we are not wearing boxing gloves
Oh,
or, right?
I was looking forward to that part. Just kidding.
Welcome everyone who's coming. So we know people are still kind of like streaming into the chat and streaming into like just connecting. And so we wanted to give you all just like a minute or two so that you could, join us and get settled, etc. Do you have a nice caffeinated beverage, Sharif?
I got water. I had my two
Okay.
coffees because it's already noon here in the East Coast.
I guess if you have a bunch of caffeine now, you might be up all night.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not gonna be a pleasant person at night. So enough caffeine for the day. What about
So,
you? Did you get your caffeine?
oh, I have some nice Coke Zero, or I think they named it Zero Sugar now, some
Yeah,
sort of branding, marketing thing I don't understand. Um,
yeah.
Everyone in the audience, could you put in the chat which city that you're phoning in from? Because as you can see above my head, I'm phoning in from Victoria, BC, and Sharif is phoning in from Ottawa, Canada, where I used to live, and that's where we met.
Wow, all over the place.
Awesome.
Brazil, lovely.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. Kampala, Uganda, Mumbai, Pretoria, Frankfurt, New Hampshire. Oh my gosh.
Israel.
Tel Aviv. Oh my gosh, this is totally amazing. All of you are amazing. And and yes, Sharif, I am comfortable to talk about all the things.
Awesome.
So, New York, Las Vegas, Houston, Denver. This is amazing. Okay, so it's 4 minutes after the hour, so I think we could probably start. Does that work for you, Sharif?
It does.
Okay, so
All right.
welcome everyone to the joint webinar from Bright Security and also Software Secured and Reshift. So Sharif, how about you tell us a little bit about you and about both of your companies, and then I'll talk about me and my company.
Yeah, that sounds great. So, hello everyone. My name is Sherif Koussa. I am the CEO and founder of a couple of companies, one called Software Secured, and Software Secured is a penetration testing as a service company based out of Ottawa, Canada. Reshift Security is a kind of like a subsidiary of Software Secured, and it is a static code analysis tool for software developers. We're going to explain all about that in the next 55 minutes or so. But basically, I started out as a developer long time ago, and I spent about 7, 8 years writing enterprise code. And then I came this lovely thing called OWASP, the Open Web Application Security Project. And basically, I realized all of the bugs I've been writing in my enterprise software, and I decided to switch. So I joined OWASP. I wrote a lot of open source code for OWASP, particularly in WebGoat. One thing led to the other. I find myself writing questions for GAC exams, the GSSP Java and GSSP Net. If you did one of those exams and you cursed, I'm sorry, that would be me. But then one thing led to the other. I find myself doing security code review for Wells Fargo. And then I started Software Secured in 2010 and Reshift in 2019. That's me.
That's awesome. So I'm Tanya Janca. I'm also known as She Hacks Purple. And I was a dev for a long time. And then I met Sharif and a bunch of other people that were into AppSec. And Sharif invited me to join OWASP with him. And he was the OWASP leader, and he arranged all these talks and stuff. And I got to learn more and more. And eventually he started letting me volunteer, and I started helping organize different talks and events. And then we ended up forming like a much bigger volunteer team with a whole bunch of amazing humans. And basically I got to participate in this amazing community because I met Sharif. So I think he's pretty great.
Thank you. Thank you, Tanya. Thank you. Appreciate it. All
Yes.
right.
And oh,
Why?
and Bright. So I founded a startup in 2020, February, the worst time ever to start a startup. Um,
Or
and it
maybe
was
the
called
best.
right? It was called We Hack Purple. And we got acquired by Bright Security, as you can see above me, in May 2022. And so now I'm working with them and I'm running their developer relations. And what they do is create a dynamic application security testing tool. So that's one of the things we're going to talk about today. So Sherif, do you want to just explain what the heck is SAST and why do we have so many acronyms? Just kidding, you don't have to answer the acronym question because that's too hard.
Acronyms because we love acronyms, but SAST stands for Static Application Security Testing, which is basically static code analysis or linting, if you might call it that, for security purposes to find security vulnerabilities in source code. That's basically what SAST is.
Yes. Okay. So DAST is sort of like the complement to SAST. So while SAST looks at the code your team wrote, dynamic application security testing, or DAST, it looks at your application as it's actually running. So it's on a container, or it's running in a container, it's on a web server, it's on a platform as a service. So it's actually running. And then the dynamic tool interacts with your application. So it starts out nice, it just clicks some links and checks things out. It's like reading requests and responses. It's being so nice and passive. And then you tell it, I would like you to destroy this app now. And then it goes and it interacts with your application and
It
it
will
writes
actually
scripts.
do that.
So it sends your own requests and your own responses, trying to find vulnerabilities, just like SAST is trying to find as many vulnerabilities as it can, but it's doing it from interacting with the running app versus looking at your actual written code and not actually running it. So they're kind of different, but I don't know. We called this SAST versus DAST, and we're like, we're gonna fight. But I feel like we can just tell all of you now, Sherif and I don't really fight. Um, and and I don't know about you, but I think both are essential if you want to actually have a good look at your app. What do you think, Sherif?
That's a good point, actually. Um, I think this statement is true, but there's a lot of parameters around that, such as the size of the company, the technology that you're scanning, who is actually doing the scanning, things like that. And I hope we can cover all of that for people so that they can understand when to use what. Obviously, for a proper integration of security into CI/CD, you would kind of need both. But I want to walk people through kind of like what is DAST really good at? What is SAST really good at? When does it make sense to kind of like use both? When does it make sense to use one? At which stage? Because I'm pretty sure people here are coming from all sorts of industries, sizes, etc. Tanya, what do you like most about DAST?
Okay, so the thing I like the most about it is that it's really easy. Um, so when I was like a dev, basically a software developer,
Mhm.
and then I first started learning about security, the first thing I learned was DAST. And I
Mhm.
used a free open source scanner, and all I had to do was point it at my app, and it started
Mhm.
finding vulnerabilities. So I had no idea what
Mhm.
I was doing. I didn't know how to configure it. I literally knew very, very little, and I pointed it at it and I found things wrong. And I know this might sound silly, but I felt very powerful. I was like, look, I know all this stuff I didn't know before. Like, I know the secret
Yep.
password sort of thing to get into the stuff. And also that I could just run it on my app without necessarily having to have access to the source code. Because
That's right.
so so as I
That's right.
continued working in AppSec, some places I went to work, and Sharif, like since you've done consulting at a zillion different organizations, you might have run into this, but I went to work at this one org, and the security team had basically ticked off the developers so much that they wouldn't even give me read-only access to the code repository. They had so little trust. They're like, you
Yep.
can't even look at our code. You're all such a bunch of idiots. But so then I could dynamically scan their apps and still find vulnerabilities and report it to them, and then eventually build enough trust that I ended up getting read-only access, even though the rest of the full-time team never was granted because
Yeah.
everyone still really was not pleased with them. But I'm like, I'm new and I'm not so bad,
Yeah.
please.
Yeah.
I come in
The fu-
peace.
yeah, the funny thing is that I started my career not as a penetration testing, not from the dynamic side. I started from the code side as a security code review. That was my first introduction into security, unlike probably 99.9% of the people in the industry. So when I started software security, I said, great, that's a differentiator we can do. But then I had the same problem is that people source code. No, I don't want to give you the source code. I don't trust you, right? So one of the things I do like about DAST, it's technology or tech stack agnostic. It doesn't really matter what you're building the application with. It is going to do a very good job, whether you're building it with PHP, with Java, with C Sharp, with what have you, right?
Yeah, it's
What do you
true.
like about SAST?
I like that it shows me exactly where in the code it thinks there's a problem.
Yeah,
I like
that's right.
that if, so I've worked at a lot of different places, which you have too, Sharif. And so sometimes I work with companies and they need it to be perfect. They need it to
Yes,
be absolutely perfect. They need to find every single possible vulnerability that could happen. And they want to dive down every potential rabbit hole. And so
yes,
SAS can show you any potential problem. And then you can sit there and kind
right.
of go through the code and follow the path and then decide for yourself or add extra mitigations. If you have a mitigation, but it's like, I don't know if that's the best, you can add more. Where with a
Yeah.
dynamic tool, it's like, we think this is exploitable, so go get it. But it
Hmm.
doesn't find every single part of the code. DAST only finds what you're showing it, right? Like it
Exactly.
could miss parts. But also there's sort of newer generation SASTs where they like I've seen some where they do sort of anti-pattern matching
Hmm.
and they like semgrep stuff like that where they're like, we know this is bad. But
Yeah.
they miss some things, but they're faster. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
Like I've
Right.
seen some stuff like that. And so I've worked at places where they need it to be perfect. And I've worked at places where they're like, we need to not be pathetic. We're trying
Yeah.
to have like a basic border, like a line of
Yeah.
security that's not embarrassing. Right
Yeah.
now it's embarrassing. There's injection everywhere. We want to go from embarrassing to respectable. We know that if like an advanced nation state is trying to get in, that is a force to be
Hmm.
dealt with, but we want to make sure 14-year-olds that are angry in their mom's basement that they
Hmm.
can't get in.
Yeah.
And so it's nice that SAS sort of gives you a choice of like, I need perfection versus it's like, only show me the sure thing. Do you know what I
Yes.
mean?
Yes. I also like SAST because you can teach it new things. So, for example, using like if you write rules, it can find really complicated scenarios. So, for example, let me tell you kind of like an anti-pattern. So basically, I worked for a big organization that didn't want developers to write any SQL code. They couldn't use an ORM for some reason, but they said, okay, we're still going to write SQL statements from scratch, but we don't want developers to write it. So they wrote this library and they exposed a bunch of APIs. So if you want to select, call this library. If you want an update, call this library. If you want to do this, call this library. And they use the SAST to basically not find SQL injections, but find every single piece of code that is writing SQL without calling the APIs, right? So that's kind of like something cool that SAST can kind of like cover. So when would you recommend people to use SAST over DAST and the other way around? Like
But
if I have to use one tool right now, what would that be?
um, I think it would definitely depend on how much access you
Mm-hmm.
have. So I've worked at places where they want to automate everything, but
Mm-hmm.
they don't. Basically, I don't know how to say this nicely. They're like, all the code's in one spot. The apps
Yeah.
are everywhere. We don't have a correct inventory. We
Mm-hmm.
don't have access to each CI/CD. Every dev makes their own CI/CD, and we have no access over that. So I'll often say, what you want is SAST, and you want to
Yeah.
connect it to your code repo. And every new check-in, you have it scan the delta, like the new code, and then once a week you have it scan the whole thing. And then it doesn't matter if the devs are like participating. It doesn't matter if the devs are cooperating. If you can get
Mm-hmm.
it connected to the code repo, and if theoretically all the code is in the same repo, then you can finally get a look at everything. And
Mm-hmm.
so then I would definitely say SAST, because you can't have DAST just scan a code repo.
Right.
But if you aren't allowed access to the code repo, but you are
Yeah.
allowed in a CI/CD, or even if you're not allowed in the CI/CD, you can just have a DAST run every night or every Friday on all of the links that you can find. You can
Right.
also use the DAST to try to like catalog all the different links and all the extra stuff and find more things
Mm-hmm.
depending upon which tool you're using. But most of them can do kind of spidering and cataloging and find all sorts of links that sometimes lead to another page where you're like, oh, that's our app too. That's nice.
Yeah.
Thanks, buddy. I'm going to scan that too now.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so I tend to do it based on like what type of access and relationship they have with the software developers. I'm assuming from the security team's perspective.
Gotcha. Yeah. Gotcha. Yeah.
What about you?
I agree. I think if the security team is running it and they have a clear definition because they need a running instance of application to run a DAST by definition, right? So that would be easier for the security team because now they can go to a developer and say, I found this bug and here's my evidence, which is something that SAST doesn't give you. SAST gives you a potential bug, while DAST gives you, this is a bug and here's the evidence, a screenshot, a request, a response, something, right? The developers, if the developers are running it, SAST might be a good contender because they do understand the code a whole lot better. So they would realize, they would understand what is this piece doing right away, whether it's really a bug or not. I like DAST because of its ability to be integrated into the CI/CD, kind of like before pushing to production. If I have to choose, it really depends on the stage and the maturity of the company. If this is your first thing ever, I would choose a DAST.
Yeah.
It's easier, it's quicker. It will tell you what the hacker would be able, if they have the same tool, this is what they're going to see, right?
Yes. Yes. Because so like when I discovered DAST, I was like, wait, so any moron on the internet can download one of these for free because there's so many free ones. They can point it at my app and then see all these vulnerabilities. I'm like, I feel naked. like, like, because someone on the internet, unless you are a company that does open source, someone on the internet generally doesn't have access to your source code, and therefore they can't run a SAST and find all those extra things. So when they're trying to attack a vulnerability that you found only with your SAST, one that your DAST did not pick up, that means
Mm-hmm.
that if an attacker is exploiting it, it's because they're a very creative attacker that they figured that out, or they tried 1,000 things and they've
Mm-hmm.
been like gunning for you for quite a while. I just realized the Q&A thing. We have a whole bunch of questions in the Q&A. Harry's asking, what do you think about IAST, interactive application security testing? I think
Go ahead.
that it sounds pretty cool, but it's very late in the system development lifecycle. So I've had some companies that I've worked with that have set it up, and the responses I've had is, it's really, really awesome if you can afford it because it's very expensive, but the things it finds are sure things. And I've also heard that the instrumentation, like the setting it up, can sometimes take a really long time, but that what it finds is usually really accurate. But you don't find it until either the testing phase or more likely when it's in production, then it can
Mm-hmm.
find more stuff. So I feel like it's something I would use in addition to SAST and DAST, because I wouldn't want to put something all the way into production without testing it a lot first.
Yep. Yep. So let me explain to people kind of like
But it is.
what it is. So we explained what SAST is, static application security testing. We explained what DAST is, which is dynamic application security testing. IST is interactive application security testing. In a nutshell, what it does is, let's say you have a Java application. So basically there's an agent that hooks into the JVM. And through the JVM, this agent kind of looks and say, it has access to the source code originally supposed to be running, and it also have access to the code that will actually run. So for example, if you have a select statement that says select asterisk from table, okay, that's the one that's supposed to be running. But the actual one that is actually running is select asterisk from table, union table. Oh, this looks different than this. There's a bug here. So that's why AST, to complete the picture for people, there is also another similar technology called RASP, which stands for Runtime Application Security Protection. So think of a WAF that is very close to the application, kind of thing, just to make it simpler for folks. So with that being said, I agree with you. It's a little bit late in the life cycle. I heard some people complaining about because it hooks into the JVM, so there is some overhead into the speed of the application. Most of the bugs are going to be found on production because it needs the code to be exercised. It doesn't have a way. So compared to DAST, DAST can force exercise some code paths. Right, it can force exercise because the way a DAST usually works, it kind of like scans the whole website, it tries to crawl, so it can force a lot of the paths. Well, IST cannot do that, so it has to wait for the code to be exercised.
Yeah. So when he says exercised, folks, he means that the app is being interacted with. So requests are being sent, responses are being read, a new request is sent with new information. And the best way for IaaS to have that happen is actual real life usage of the app. And so you can run it during your QA phase, and you can do all your QA testing, and you can do all of your pen testing on it, like while it's plugged in there. And that's nice, but that's not real normal usage. And what you want to know is that when real humans use it, that it works well and perfectly, and that it doesn't do things it's not supposed to do. And so if you get the most usage when it's actually being used in production, not testing phases.
Yeah, you know, the time, like when I used IST and RASP, because they usually come together, IST and RASP are best suited towards application that are in a dormant state, where this is application wrote 20 years ago. I don't want to change anything. The developers moved on. There is nothing I can do. But there's a really big bug. Now I need to go and fix it. So IST is going to tell you that, right?
Yeah.
With a very high degree of accuracy. So you have an ROI to dig into the code, change it with all of the risks that comes with changing an application that is kind of like in a dormant situation.
Yeah, sometimes we'll find a bug, and the bug is such that you have to re-architect the entire application to solve the bug. And it's like, that's going to cost $400,000, but a WAF will be like $10,000, or a RASP will be like $20,000. And you know what? A RASP looks really attractive right now.
Yep, it can work. It can work compared to, as you said, the cost to change one line of code. Literally, sometimes could be hundreds of thousands of dollars. I helped a company that it literally cost that much, not because of the developer's time, because they need to send a patch, and that patch in testing and deployment and client acceptance and client testing, all of that cost combined, they calculated it was $150,000. I remember the number because I was shocked for changing one bug, fixing one bug.
It's a big deal, Sherif. It really is.
I know.
We have like a zillion more questions in the chat, which is really awesome, or in the Q&A part. So there's an anonymous one. I'm curious what you see companies using for DAST for cloud applications, and how are they using it with cloud applications? So since I work at Bright, I'm seeing companies use Bright to test things, but I see companies using a lot of different dynamic application security testing tools. Depending upon what they're doing, I would say that if you're going to give the tool to a software developer, you want to give them a safer tool. Sherif, I don't know if you've ever blown something up with like a web proxy automated scanning tool, but I have accidentally completely destroyed one production site and one still in dev site where my automated scanner somehow gone to the admin module, made like a zillion accounts, it deleted the database, it did like all this crazy
Yep.
stuff
Yep.
before I realized it, and because of the fuzzer. And so I would say that companies, if you're going to give it to a software developer, you don't necessarily want it to have a fuzzer in it because that can be the danger zone. Versus if you're going to have it in the hands of a security expert, like a penetration tester, then they can handle a fuzzer. They can use it like a scalpel in a surgeon's hand versus a scalpel in a klutz's hands. So, but how are they using it with cloud applications? In my opinion, a DAST works the exact same way as if it's hosted on premises or not. You just point it at the IP address or the URL that it's at, and then you go to town. Sherif, do you have any?
That's the beauty about DAST, right? It doesn't care. As long as it talks HTTP, it's all good. It's all good for a DAST, right? Some DASTs are different from each other. Some are good with JavaScript, some are not good with JavaScript, some are good with APIs, some are not good with APIs. But the main premise is I don't really care as a DAST. Just give me an HTTP request. I'm gonna deal with it. That's the beauty about DAST.
And maybe so if your cloud has a web application firewall or a RASP, you might want to add your dynamic scanner to its approved list, sometimes called a wait list. So if you add it to your approved list, then it should be able to get through and actually do the testing and not just be blocked half the time by the WAF. I remember being hired to test a WAF once. And I was like, knock, 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 is this thing on? Because 100% of my attacks are getting through. And eventually, like, it started blocking me. And I was like, okay, we got it. This is good. But it's like everything was getting through. I'm like, guys, these are not good things. They should not be getting through to your app.
There are two schools of thoughts here. There's the first school of thought is, well, I don't want to be fighting with your WAF, right? And getting over it. So just disable the WAF and let me optimize the time. Let's say I have a 1 week pen test or whatever. Let me optimize my task. I'm fighting with your application, not with the WAF. And the other school of thought says, well, what is the risk here? The risk is an attacker, and the attacker is not going to get directly to my application. He has to go through the WAF. So that's a more realistic risk. So I think this is something that people has to kind of like just understand. If we're testing with a WAF, this is kind of like, we're going to waste a lot of time fighting with the WAF, but this is a real hacker would do. If we don't have a lot of time, disable the WAF, so we're not fighting with the WAF, we're just directly with the application, and the WAF is just another layer of defense, right?
Yeah, I also feel like it depends on the purpose of the pen test. Like, is the pen test just because you want to measure the risk that you're facing as an organization, engaging how safe you are? Or are you doing a penetration test because you want to find all the vulnerabilities in your application so you can fix them and have a rock solid app? Like, I don't want to measure risk as much as I want to secure my app personally. Like, that's what I would look for. But I've also, quite frankly, had companies say, well, we're testing you. We want to know if you're good. And I was like, wow, this contract doesn't pay enough. Like, dude, you hired me. I just assumed, like, wow, thanks, bud.
Gotcha.
There's more. I have more questions in the chat. So from someone named Tails, about DAST test in app, the test can break the app's performance. So I think that we need to interpret that question a bit. I'm not sure if what they mean is while you're running that dynamic scanner, is that going to cause latency for other people if the app is in production and being used at that exact time? And yeah, it could use up a bunch of resources.
But that's basically kind of like exposes like an inefficiency in the application, that there is some resource that is being consumed and not released, right? It shouldn't. It like what happens if you got a bunch of users tomorrow? That's exactly what the DAST is doing, right? But it could affect the performance of the application. That's why like I would suggest, if people are doing DAST as part of shift left strategy, test against staging if possible, right?
Yes. So someone actually, so there's so many questions, which is so awesome. Thank you everyone that's putting questions in. This is amazing because Sherif and I had a bunch of questions, but I don't know how to say this. I like the audience's questions better. So someone says, Sorry if I'm being thick. You're not being thick. Can we outline the differences between IAST and DAST? Do you want to do that one, or do you want
Sure,
me to do it?
sure.
Okay.
So DAST is basically stands for Dynamic Application Security Testing. What that means is I am going to do the following as a tool. I am going to find all of the possible requests, methods, everything that I can talk to the application with, all of the gets, all of the posts, all of the heads, all of the deletes. And I'm going to try to find every single parameter in those requests. So let's say the get, there's a couple of requests, the post has 5 requests. And I'm going to try to send every single piece of payload that would throw the application off. I'm going to try to send SQL injection payloads, cross-site scripting, everything. And from the response I get, I'm going to try to figure out if there is an error here. So for example, let's say that there is a get and there is a parameter called name. In the name, I'm going to put a single quote. So I'm going to try first without a single quote. I get a 200 OK. I put a single quote, I got 500, right?
Mm-hmm.
See, I just put a single quote and the response from the application is different. In this case, I might deduce that there might be a SQL injection here because a single quote is a very a prominent way of figuring out whether it's SQL injection. So that's very simplistic how a DAST works. An IST works totally different. An IST is basically a piece of code that you put in a JVM or on the server. Let's just make it simple. So this piece of code will have access to 2 things. It will have access to the source code of the application, the code that is supposed to run, and it will have access to the source code that is actually running. And it will look at the 2 versions and it will say, this looks different than this. This must be a vulnerability. If they look similar, the code that was supposed to run versus the code that is actually running, if they're similar, then there is no bug. Otherwise, there is a bug. I'm not sure if that answers the question.
No, it does. There's a
Yeah,
bit
great.
more. So, like
Sure, go ahead.
Sharif said earlier, a DAST, it doesn't matter what technology you're using. If
Yeah.
it's a web app or an API, pew pew, we're gonna get you. It doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
But with a RASP, it's very technology
Yep.
dependent. So a RASP will support, let's say, Java, .NET, but it might not
IST,
do
you mean?
TypeScript. Or an
IST, you
IAST,
mean?
yes, sorry. An IAST, it might say like, I just do, I don't do Ruby. So then that means if half your apps are Ruby apps, it doesn't work for you.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so there's also, quite frankly, a price difference. IAST is because there's only, I think, 2 or 3 providers at this point. It tends to be quite high compared to a lot of the dynamic scanners. Not that that means you shouldn't get one, but I see like a price difference generally. But it does a different thing.
Yeah.
There's a question in the chat. What is the difference WAS and DAST? So I think you might mean WAF and DAST. So a WAF, a web application firewall, is a shield in front of your application. It's generally a whole bunch of regex, like regular expressions, and it'll sit on your web server or your load balancer or someplace in front of your web app. And every single input to your application goes through the WAF, and the WAF looks at it and it's like, does this look suspect? If so, it can block or just alert you. I mean, ideally, it's blocking things. And basically, the tighter you tune your WAF, like the more things you're blocking, you might accidentally block
Yeah.
a real business request. And that makes everyone really upset. So you have to walk like a really special line with the WAF of trying to block as many things as possible without blocking any legitimate business requests.
It looks like Dixie was asking WAS as in Web Application Scanner. That's the first for me that I hear this this term. But so what would be the difference between Web Application Scanner and a DAST?
Oh, so I would
Tanya?
call that a VA scanner. I would call
Yeah.
that like a vulnerability assessment scanner. And so Tenable, I think you mean Nessus by Tenable.
I
If you
think so
mean
too.
that,
Yeah.
Yeah, that scans your infrastructure. So that will scan your operating system. It'll scan a container or a virtual machine, and it'll tell you, you know what? You're missing like 400 patches, and these configuration choices are suspect. And also, this looks weird. You should check that out. Like,
Mhm.
you have SSL still enabled, and you shouldn't do that anymore. That's old. Or you have encryption keys that are way out of date, like they're too small, your algorithm's weak, etc. And so that it's more an infrastructure look as opposed to a web application look, like at your custom applications that you created or that you
Mhm.
bought. You can also test like a SaaS product if you have permission. If it lives on the internet, you can test it with a dynamic scanner. If it's your infrastructure, you would use something, I guess, a WAS, a web application. Like, yeah,
Mhm.
I've never heard of the term WAS before.
Uh,
Sharif?
Yeah, me neither. Me neither. But I agree with you, Tanya. The only thing I might add is something like Nessus. They do check a bit of the web application, but things in the realm of hey, your application is exposing some like the Java version it's using, or exposing the web application server it's exposing. There are some missing. Your ciphers, the ciphers they're using are weak, but it would not crawl the application. It will not, wouldn't have something to log in, crawl, fuzz every parameter, go that deep. So it's more on, hey, these are the patches you're missing. These are the HTTP response headers that are you leaking, things like that. Less so towards the kind of like the what we described as in crawls, find all of the inputs, try to fuzz all of the inputs, give you an understanding of whether this is a bug or not. That level, that depth.
Awesome. So there are so many questions, but before
I know.
one rolls off the screen of the chat, so MTTR, the mean time to remediation. So how long from when we find the bug to when we actually fix the bug?
Yeah.
It's a core KPI that organizations use to measure successive risk reduction. What do you
Yeah.
personally prefer in a SaaS solution? One, speedy scans with some or many false positives, or way longer scan times with close to none or few false positives. I don't
Yeah.
find that that's the way it works personally. I find that if a SAST is faster, it's usually doing pattern matching, and it's like, I match this pattern, I'm pretty darn sure this is crap, but it has false
Yeah.
negatives. It
Yeah.
misses stuff. And then
Yeah.
the ones that are longer and slower, they'll find everything and they will have false positives. I haven't found that a way longer scan means no false positives. What do you think?
Okay, so that's so I looked into that very extensively, and White Hat Security has a very good report recently, I think 2019, 2020, something like that. And you will find the mean time to remediation in SAST lower than the mean time to remediation to DAST, but that's not the whole story. The actual time to scan is nothing compared to the whole time mean time to remediation, because the longest scan will take what, a couple of days, 3 days, right? But industry standard is the mean time to remediation, average vulnerability is about 3 months, right? So that scan, whatever it's a couple of hours, a couple of days, that's nothing compared to the total number you're looking at. The most amount of time is lost in reporting, getting things fixed, retesting, confirming it's closed. That's where you need to focus your time, not the actual technologies. Both technologies are probably going to give you good mean time. It is just, where are we losing time? It is not in the scan, it's somewhere else, right? So that's what I would answer to that one. The reason that I think I suspect that in White Hat's report, SaaS was much lower is because developers are running it. So it is faster to get back into their workflow. And DAST was longer because security teams were running it and they have to hop multiple times to get it into the developer's workflow. If you can get the DAST into the developer workflows, you're going to see a closer number, I suggest, because it's not, if there is a delay, it is not because of the scan time. It is because
Yeah.
of the time it takes to report it, get it fixed, retest it, right?
I would like to note that I agree very, very strongly with Sherif about this. It's so true. And it'll be the security team. They email a report to the devs get it, they're like, what the heck does this mean? And then
Yep.
they call a meeting with the devs, that takes like another week. And then
Mm-hmm.
they'll go over the report. And sometimes the security people just confuse the devs more than is necessary in that meeting. I've seen a lot of like doom and gloom, we'll all die if you don't fix this right now. And then the devs have to schedule it because they actually have another job other than just fixing things we ask for. And so then they have to try to fit it into the whole stuff they're doing, and then the retesting and actually getting release. And release isn't 100 times a day at every single place. Like I know Etsy and Netflix and fancy companies, like they're like, oh, we release like 20 times a day. I'm like, that's awesome. Almost no one else is able to do that. A
Mm-hmm.
lot of places release every 2 weeks or even every 3 months. And so then you could be waiting forever to get those fixes.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a question here that is, I'm not sure if it's a real question or not, but I'm going to answer it anyway. I'm curious what the pen testers were doing to upset the devs that much. Would like to avoid doing that in the future. So, because I kind of work in a pen testing as a service shop, so I know that quite well. And the truth is, developers spend a lot of time building. They are trained to build. And we pen testers are trained to break. I'm sorry, that's the way it does. So imagine yourself building something for a month and I just look at it
Beautiful.
for half a day and I just tore it apart. How would you feel? Right? Not great, right? How can you help? The way you are introducing that to the developers makes a lot of sense. There are some pen testers that come across and say, and just kind of like boast, oh yeah, that took me half an hour. It doesn't make fit anybody good, right? Building is
No.
much easier, is much harder than breaking. Let me put it that way, right?
Yeah.
The other thing that the best pen tester will come across saying, here is the bug and here's the fix. What else can I do to help you, right?
Yes.
So you're gonna get a listening ear, you're gonna get a friend, not an enemy on the software development side of things. What do you think, Tanya?
Yes. Oh my gosh, so much. I also want to add that sometimes, so if you're an external penetration tester and you're coming in and you're delivering bugs, being humble is important. Like, hey, I found something. Can we talk about it? Like, here's how I would suggest fixing it. So, like, no arrogance.
Mm-hmm.
No one wants to hear your baby is ugly and I don't like your baby. Um, but on top of that, sometimes security teams, like I've come into places where there's a lot of tension between the devs and the security team. And it's often from not awesome communication. It's often like security policies that aren't based in reality. Like I've seen secure coding policies where they're like developers shall never write insecure code. I'm like, well, that doesn't
Yeah,
make sense.
that's
And
that
that's
doesn't
not
make any
impossible.
sense.
Like, and it's
Doesn't make any
impossible,
sense.
right? And
Yeah.
and sometimes I've worked with security teams where they're like, why do these devs just write such crappy code? If they just like tried it all, because it's so easy. Actually, it's really hard.
Yeah.
It's really hard to write perfectly secure code. If you don't
Yeah.
have a bunch of tools checking and helping you, like imagine writing an entire book and never having a spell checker, and then someone saying, oh, you made all these spelling mistakes and typos, you're so stupid. It's like,
Yeah.
no, we have to offer support to them. They have to have as many tools as we can give
Mm-hmm.
them to help them. And then we need to have a second set of eyes on that to find things that are missing. And so sometimes when a security team will say, like, just patch it, it's not that hard. And meanwhile, you have to actually to update that dependency, you have to update 9 other dependencies, and that means you have to change these codes and that function is no longer available, etc. It's because it's coming
And
from a place that
retest everything else again, and then the field, if your customer might find other bugs. So think about all of that. It is not just one line, it's all of what's gonna happen after that one line, right?
and
Yeah.
I think it's about a lack of experience and a lack of empathy because they don't have that experience. Because Sharif and I were both devs. We're like, oh, yeah, this looks like a ton of work. How can we add this to your project schedule? Or because we've been there. But when a security person who is an expert at networking or at firewalls or at like PKI, like other areas of security, and they're like, just patch it. It's like, that's, I don't want to say it's an arrogant, it's an ignorant statement. And it's not intentionally ignorant necessarily. But sometimes I think they imagine devs are sitting there and there's like an upgrade button and they're not pressing the button. It's like, no, of
Yeah,
course they, if it was just
a
pressing
lot
a
of
button, of
work.
course they would press the stupid button.
A lot of work. It's a lot of work. All right. Which question do you want to take on next, Tanya?
So there's one question, who is the person responsible for DAST? And I feel that this really depends. I like when I was a software developer and I switched to security, I started doing pen tests and I would do like manual testing and stuff, and I owned the DAST. But then I realized there's 150 of them and one of me. So then I started teaching a bunch of them to use it, just the basic DAST scan. I'm like, you don't need to do super complicated things. Just run the basic scan, and if you find a high or a medium, fix it. And I will come give you a high five at your desk and tell you you're awesome. and that was great because between all of them, we got everything scanned. But if it was just me, I'm like, this is gonna be a while, guys. What do you think, Sherif? Who owns the DAST?
Historically, it was the security team for a bunch of reasons. One, that was their job, mainly to run the DAST. That's it, right? Two, the developers there was nothing called integrate security into a software development lifecycle. What is that, right? Plus, the tools were really hard for developers to use. They were clunky. They needed a server to run on. It needed kind of like a few days of training, etc. Came a bunch of tools, including Bright, that made it super easy for you to run a DAST, to integrate it into your CI, for developers to use it. Plus, a regular developer now is expected to know at least what OWASP top 10 is, like what a SQL injection is, what across 5 years ago, 10 years ago, that was not the case, right? So it needed a special breed of people, if you will, that runs the DAST. So now anybody can run it, really, in the software development organization. Yeah.
Yes, and then that can lead to interesting results. Like I've seen some software developer teams where they're like, give me that, and they like run away with it, and they're like, this is my tool now, and then they start sending me really nice code, and they're like, that SAST tool, it's mine too. I'm like, yes, this sounds great to me. Not that I don't want to have a job anymore, but I am really pleased about that. Oh my gosh, there's so many different questions, Sherif. Do you want to pick the last question? Because we're running out of time.
Sounds good. How about this one? How much of coding knowledge is required to be an AppSec specialist? Coming from an infrastructure side, I want to know this. Okay, so think about it this way. Who's your customer? Right?
Your customer is a software developer.
Exactly. So if you cannot talk the same language as your customer, then it's going to be a problem. Now, we do not need to be a developer. That's kind of like the problem that people run into. You just need to understand what is this piece of code is trying to do. You do not need to write one, right? You do not need to write a compile code. You don't need to be a Java expert. You don't need to know all of the APIs, all of the function calls. You just need to be, one, not afraid from code, because I've seen a lot of security specialists that when they see code, they're like, no, I don't want to see that. Well, you have to break that barrier. That's one thing. The second thing is you read the code, try to make your best guess and have a conversation with the developer. That's what you need to do, basically.
I would also say, I would say that it's really important that you understand the system development lifecycle at your organization. 100%. So every organization does it slightly differently. So some people, they do like a very strict waterfall model. I saw a place once that did mini waterfalls. So they had 6 waterfalls because their project was a year and a half long, and they would do like the whole thing 6 times. And then there's places where they ship code constantly and they're doing DevOps, and that's awesome. There's places where they're like, well, we have a Scrum meeting every morning, but then they just do waterfall and they call themselves agile. So what you need to do is know the way that your software developers are releasing code and figure out how you can fit some security stuff in there without pissing everyone off. That's really important part. It doesn't mean that there's never going to be friction, but it's really important you figure out the way that they're working and then how you can add security into the way they're working. And so if they're doing very strict waterfall, you could go to the project kickoff meeting and say, listen, in our schedule, I need to have time to hire Sherif to come in and do a secure code review. And then we want him to come in again and do a pen test. And we also have this list of security requirements for you that we want to be included in this project. Like, you're building an API, A+, I want you to use this gateway. I want you to do this. I want you to do that. And so if you can especially be right at the beginning of the project and tell them your expectations, the end of the project is going to be a happier time for you than if you show up at the end of the project and you're like, why didn't you do this stuff?
So yeah, so basically forget about what are you following, agile, waterfall, this, that, because in a lot of cases, you're not doing what you say you're doing, like what Tanya mentioned, agile, and you're doing waterfall, and you're doing agile. Focus more on the actual activities that the software development team are actually doing, and try to patiently inject security activities in those.
Yes. So I have a question for you. Can
Sure.
you tell us a little bit about Reshift? Can you just tell us a
Yes.
bit about it?
So Reshift is a static code analysis for security, and it's meant for developers to use it. And why the question I get all the time is, why does the world need another static code analysis tool? What I have seen, so basically my time at Wells Fargo, this is all what I did. As I said, I started from a code review, so I was using one of the kind of like the enterprisey tools a lot. And this is not a tool that anybody would enjoy using on a daily basis. Me as a security professional, I did not enjoy it. So how would a developer enjoy it? Combined with the fact that if we can integrate fast, accurate checking of some sort in the development lifecycle, when the developer is still writing, that would be awesome. The problem with traditional static code analysis tools is this is very simplistically how they work. They read all of the source code, they draw a big giant graph in the memory, and they use the rules to follow that graph and try to find a relation between the source and the sink, and that would be a bug, right? The problem with that model is, as the code gets slightly bigger, that giant graph in the memory gets exponentially larger, right? That's why literally the tool that I was using costed the organization that I was working, I'm not kidding, $1 million a year. And it would run out of memory scanning JavaScript, because a tiny piece of JavaScript, because of the lack of typing and the lack of a bunch of things in JavaScript, would lead to a gigantic graph. And in Reshift, we are not doing that. What we're doing is taking the same data that would have been thrown into the memory and creating a database-like structure with it, right? So that database can grow very, very big. It doesn't matter, because we know how to work with really large databases, but we do not really know how to work with really large blobs in memory. So we take that data, put it in a database, and this data becomes queryable. We can query this data and find exactly what we're looking for, and the rule becomes a query. So think about it this way. We take the data, put it in a database-like structure, and the rule becomes a query to ask the database questions about, hey, does this method have any sink? Does this sink has any source, and things like that. So it's much faster, much more accurate than traditional static code analysis tools. Hope that helps.
It really does. And also much faster and way fewer false positives. That helps.
Yep.
So I'm going to obviously tell you about Bright now. So Bright makes a dynamic application security testing tool. And some of the things that really separate us from others is, one, we are fast, but two, we have almost no false positives, because basically we do a scan and we find a bunch of stuff, and then we do a separate different test to validate every single result. And if the second test doesn't work, we don't report it. And so with that, we've managed to have almost, yeah.
Because here's what pissed me off from regular DAST, right? So for example, this is if anybody ran ran like any desk would know this. You're running a scan, the scan takes a few hours, and then 99% you will come up with a SQL injection that used a wait to confirm it, right? And basically
Yes.
what that works is the SQL injection sent a wait, like a delay, right? And
Hmm.
the response came back later than it should. Yeah, because you're sending 10,000 requests to the server. Can't you just try that again and make sure? No, it doesn't. I have to
Yes.
do that. So a tool that does that would be amazing.
And the other thing that we do is we do security unit testing. And so this
Mm,
is new, and we just started doing it for JavaScript, and we're building it out into all the different JavaScript frameworks. And so basically, you can write a unit test that's empty, and then just take that unit of code. So, like, let's say it's doing an input. So we'll give you a payload that goes into it. And so we'll spin up to 100 unit tests at the same time, and we will
awesome.
run our dynamic scanner against that small unit of code for you. And it's
Awesome.
pretty cool. And it just came out literally like 3 weeks ago. And Akira did a workshop on it. Akira's in the chat, and it was so amazing. But I
Awesome.
know I'm supposed to wrap up now, Sherif. Um,
That
I
was
wanted to
fun.
say, I know. I'm gonna just as a spoiler, I'm gonna try to invite you on the We Hack Purple podcast just to like gonna have you back because this
Sounds
was
good.
such an amazing, amazing conversation, and it was so fun to have my friend on my webinar. Thank you.
Likewise, Tanya. And thanks for everybody who posted questions. These are amazing questions. As Tanya said, we had questions, but these are much better.
I know,
Yeah,
I know. Yeah, these questions, honestly, I'm like, I could write 100 blog posts with these questions. I want to save all of
100%.
them.
100%.
Thank you so much, Sherif Koussa from Software
Thank you.
Security and Reshift for coming to the Bright Security webinar. Thank you for everyone at Bright that did all the support that makes me and Sherif look and sound beautiful. And thank you, all the people who attended. Oh my gosh, you guys made this amazing. All of you, thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Bright. Thanks, Tanya, for having me.
Great. See you all next time. Bye.